Extreme weather has caused havoc in many countries around the world over the past several months, with record temperatures sparking wildfires, water shortages and a rise in heat-related issues. Now the government will be feeling the heat as well, governments around the world that is, as the European Court of Human Rights will rule in an unprecedented verdict in 3 separate court cases on the climate change. The hearing is underway and the verdict is expected later in the day. Crucially, the verdicts will force them to adopt more ambitious climate policies. It will be the first time that the court will issue a ruling on climate change, while several European states, including France, have already been condemned by domestic courts for not fulfilling commitments against global warming. The ECHR it could go further and also make clear new fundamental rights. And the Supreme Court of India has given a similar verdict recently, saying that the right against climate change is a distinct, fundamental and human right. Observing how climate change is increasing year by year, the court underscored the need to recognize this right as a distinct one, as vulnerable species face several challenges because of pollution, climate change, predators and invasive species. The court said that Article 14, that is equality before law and equal protection of laws, and Article 21, that is the right to life and personal liberty of the Indian Constitution, are important sources of this right. The court has consulted an expert committee which will submit a report on or before the 31st of July 2024. The past 10 months have seen monthly temperature records broken, with the most recent, the month March on record being the hottest month, the warmest on record. So what's happened is that Climate Change Monitoring Service of the European Union reports that when compared to the equivalent month in the prior years, each of the last 10 months has been the hottest on record worldwide. The 12 months ending with March also ranked as the planet's hottest ever recorded 12-month period. So from April 2023 to March 2024, the global average temperature was 1.58 degrees Celsius above the average in the 1850 to 1900 pre-industrial period. And we are joined by Ishan Garg, who is joining us from Brussels. And we also have Navneet Vibhav, who's a partner at Shardul Aramchand Mangaldas and Company, who is a specialist in environmental law and environmental disputes. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. We'll start with you, Ishan. Now, many dimensions to these concerns, but can governments be the only ones to blame, Ishan?
The climate activists, especially here in Europe, are saying that the first line of defense against climate change is supposed to be governments, because they are the ones who can institute policies that will imminently result in climate change becoming less of a threat. They are the ones who can institute policy changes that can cut down on carbon emissions. So there's certainly a factor of government intervention. But apart from that, we have seen across Europe there's been drives to make people more concerned about the threat of climate change, so that they can do their own bit, take their own steps in the right direction, whether it be in terms of waste management or recycling. It comes down to a bit of a joint approach between the government and the private sector.
Ishan, also, what is the ambit of this court? Can it rule on banning fossil fuels, for instance? One of the pleas of the 2,000 elderly Swiss women.
Well, the ambit of the court is pretty wide. The legally binding verdict that comes out of this court will be applicable to nearly all European countries, and the widest case that we are seeing in this court is the one that concerns nearly 32 countries on the European continent. So according to many climate activists, this could be the biggest moment since 2015, when the Paris Climate Accords were signed and when leaders agreed that global average temperatures will be checked to under 2 degrees Celsius. In terms of what the court can say to ban fossil fuels, that remains to be seen yet, but it can have wide-ranging measures for countries, because it will then give citizens the possibility to sue their respective governments if the verdict today goes in favor of the petitioners here. It also opens up this legal possibility of bringing governments and various state institutions to the court, and also recognizing the right to have a good climate for the citizens, in the same sort of vein as the Indian Supreme Court has done as well.
We leave it there. Thank you very much, Ishan, for joining us. Let's turn now to our guest who specializes in this, Navneet Vibhav, partner Chardul Amarchand, I beg your pardon, Mangaldas and Company, specialization in environmental advisory and environmental disputes. Mr. Vibhav, we've seen special courts deal with climate matters. We have green tribunals and all that. Is this a human rights issue at the end of the day? Because after all, humans are collectively to blame for this.
Absolutely, Mark, and thank you for having me on the show. I think these are very much a human rights issue as well, because if you're talking about right to, and like it was mentioned earlier, we've been talking about right to clean and healthy environment. We've been talking about, the certain constitutional rights, and so this is definitely a human rights issue, because if you're talking about climate change, there are a whole lot of people across the world which are actually being impacted. You have a whole lot of people whose livelihoods are being affected. So this is very, very much a human rights issue. And I think we'll have to wait and see as to how, what is the nature of the verdict by the court today. But my sense is that people across the world are actually watching this particular judgment, because this will have very, very serious ramifications and impact in terms of how, we lead our lives, and how the companies, be it the oil companies and others, actually go about carrying out their businesses. So I think definitely, when you talk about climate change, we talk about environmental rights. These are all very much human rights issues.
Okay. Also, Mr. Vibhav, for the greenhorn in law, the people who don't understand enough about it, is the hierarchy of jurisprudence, do human rights courts have greater say than normal courts? Can they basically pass judgments like you were talking about, fossil fuels banning, coal mining, all these sort of issues, saying that they are in the interest of human safety?
So I would like to just clarify that if you're talking about a court of law, I think pretty much all courts of law deal with all kinds of issues. So there's no distinction as such between a human rights court.
But this is a human rights court, right? It has a special, it has a specialization.
So this is of course a specialized court which deals with human rights issues, and that's the mandate. Similarly, like you have a tribunal in India which deals with environmental issues, so that's the mandate. But then the idea clearly is that the reason as to why you've constituted a human rights court is because the kind of people, the judges who are actually dealing with such issues, have a better understanding of human rights issues. So if you're talking about a hierarchy, at least in the Indian context, I could tell you that, our courts, be it the high courts, be it the Supreme Court, we deal with human rights issues all the time. Okay. So I think in terms of the Indian context, the hierarchy, the way it works is, of course, you have the high courts, and above that you have the apex court, which is the Supreme Court, and judgments of the Supreme Court clearly prevail over the lower courts. So a specialized court clearly will have, I would say, have a better say, and will clearly, its verdicts will be taken a little more seriously than what a court which has a general jurisdiction would actually deal with. So right. Clearly, yeah, specialized courts.
So what I was getting at actually is that can the petitioners basically say that the jurisdiction, the court doesn't have jurisdiction, because this is a question of sustainability. There are various discussions going on. There are government forums meeting. There are COP20s, etc. All this happening, if we look at take the impact of what's happening. Let's take aviation, for instance. Now, we can see that it's growing as a means of transport, but so are the emissions then. So what's the best way forward? Can courts intervene and say, put restrictions on these kind of things?
So absolutely, I think if you see the Indian context, also we've had a number of judgments where so we're not talking about a blanket ban here. We are basically talking about regulation. And I think the courts very much have the jurisdiction. The courts have all the powers to actually kind of regulate these issues because they have a clear impact on the lives of people, be it in India or across the world. And I think if you're talking about the courts you've just mentioned, so I think they can definitely deal with these issues because these are issues which will have very, very serious impact in the years to come. So I think if you're talking about, say, waste management, if you're talking about vehicular emission, at least in the Indian context, we've had a number of judgments from the National Green Tribunal. We've also had judgments from the Supreme Court, and the latest one being, of course, with respect to the climate change judgment, which we're just mentioning about. So courts definitely have the powers. The courts should definitely use such powers and ensure that we kind of conduct ourselves in a more responsible manner across the world, not just in India.
Mr. Vibhav, also, the pandemic years, they didn't give the earth enough time to recover from pollution. But certainly we saw emissions falling. We certainly saw some sort of recovery taking place. How do we keep emissions down then in terms of, do we have to just wait for court orders? Or are there examples that we can take? You did mention circular economy to some extent. Can they be enforced then by law? By courts, actually, not by legislation.
Absolutely. I think the courts, of course, can, but I think the answer was in your question itself. I think it's more to do with behavioral changes. And I think it's not appropriate for us to just blame the government or wait for the courts to actually, make these or force us to make these lifestyle changes through their judgments. I think we are living in extremely critical times, and I think we'll have to clearly make changes in the manner in which we lead our lives, and we'll have to be more responsible in terms of our consumption, in terms of our lifestyle choices. And I think the pandemic example was the perfect example because we're all locked up in our houses, and we saw what positive impact it could actually have on the environment. So I think it's time that we actually become more responsible in terms of our choices, in terms of the adverse impact that we create on the environment. And it has to come from all of us. We cannot really rely on the government or the judiciary or, International Court of Human Rights to kind of bring about these changes because it's a question of our survival. I think so we'll have to take it much more seriously now.
Navneet Vibhav, environmental law expert, thank you very much for joining us and throwing light on this subject.